Catherine Howard was not destined to become queen, but fate had other plans for her. Her rapid rise to power was made possible by her chosen role, to be a flower among thorns at the Tudor court. Catherine found herself on this path unexpectedly and unconsciously, and her downfall became one of the most tragic pages in English history. This is the story of how a young girl became the wife of the most terrible man of her time, and how the crown, instead of protecting her, led to her downfall. Before delving into Catherine's last days, it is worth considering what it means to be a queen in a world where the king has lost his soul. If you are ready to venture into this dark corner of history, where power, fear, passion, and death intertwine, leave a comment with one word if you are ready to follow through to the end. Catherine Howard was about 15 or 16 when she arrived at Henry's court. Her exact age is unknown, as historical documents often do not describe the lives of women with sufficient accuracy. She was the niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk and cousin of Anne Boleyn, the queen who was executed by the same man who was now showing interest in Catherine, Henry VIII, the king who was already old, morbidly obese, and paranoid. Henry, suffering from constant pain, swelling, and ulcers on his feet, was increasingly isolated and cruel. But when he saw Catherine, he saw her as a symbol of renewal, of the second youth he had lost. She was everything he was no longer, young, beautiful, and full of life. She seemed to illuminate the royal court with her presence. Catherine was not raised to rule. Her childhood was spent amid scandals and turmoil in the home of the Duchess of Norfolk, where children were often left unattended and interacted with servants and soldiers. It was here that Catherine experienced her first romantic feelings, youthful relationships that would later lead her to tragedy. However, at the Tudor court, the past could easily be forgotten or hidden. Catherine became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife. The marriage to Anne was a disaster from the start. Henry considered her ugly and could not live with her. Catherine, with her charming smile and gentle manners, seemed the perfect opposite of this failure. A few months later, Henry annulled his marriage to Anne, claiming that it had never been consummated, and married Catherine Howard. The ceremony was lavish, but strangely quiet. Even then, rumors were circulating about the new queen. Some considered her an innocent victim, others an ambitious and ruthless woman, and still others a shadowy figure who would not last long. From her first day on the royal throne, Catherine found herself in a palace full of shattered dreams. Her youth was not a gift, but a burden. As Henry grew fatter and older with each passing day, she was under constant surveillance. She had no personal space, and despite this, she tried to find joy in what she could. Surrounded by young ladies, dancing, and entertainment, she pretended that her life was all fun, but in reality, every step she took brought her closer to her doom. Few knew that Catherine could not completely forget her past. Her former lover, Francis de Rem, was summoned to the palace. She appointed him her personal secretary, which seemed like an innocent move, but in an atmosphere of espionage and betrayal, it was extremely dangerous, especially when Catherine began to secretly meet with another man, Thomas Kelliper, an attractive, ambitious, and deadly dangerous courtier. These meetings took place at night, with the help of her lady-in-waiting, Lady Arford, the sister of Anne Boleyn's wife. Everything happened behind closed doors, with whispered words, quiet promises, and desires that defied logic and fear. Catherine balanced between the need to feel alive and the risk of betrayal, which was impossible to forgive. While Henry lived in a carefully constructed fantasy where Catherine was considered the ideal wife, that she sincerely loved him, that she rejuvenated him by giving him gifts, jewels, dresses, and walking with him in the gardens like a couple in love, the king knew, deep down, love was fragile, his power was feared but not admired, and Catherine's laughter was too loud to be sincere. The Tudor court was a minefield where spies, envy, ambition, and revenge intertwined in every corner. A dissatisfied servant, an intercepted note, a glance in the wrong direction. Anything could spark a storm, and that storm broke out in the most brutal way. A woman named Mary Lales, a former servant in the house where Catherine was raised, told her brother John that the young woman had led a dissolute life before becoming queen. John Lisle, a religious reformer with enemies at court, saw this information as a powerful weapon. He passed it on to Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, and a loyal ally of the king. Cranmer hesitated. He knew that this could lead to the execution of yet another queen, but he also understood that silence would make him an accomplice. He wrote a sealed letter, which he placed in the royal chapel so that Henry would find it in private. Thus began Catherine's execution, not with a scream, but with a sealed envelope opened by trembling hands. When the king read the charges, he froze for several hours. He did not utter a word, then exploded with rage, throwing objects, shouting curses, and sinking into what seemed like physical agony. He did not eat or sleep, wandering around the palace like a ghost, whispering the name of his young wife through clenched teeth, but he could not stop the machine of betrayal. The investigation had already begun. Catherine Howard did not immediately realize that everything had changed. She continued to act like a queen, walking through the corridors with the grace of a young woman who believed she was still winning the king's favor. But silence began to surround her like fog. Eyes were lowered when she passed, ladies fell silent as soon as she entered a room, and the footsteps of the guards became more frequent and heavy, echoing through the palace. The net was closing in on her. Francis Derham was the first to be arrested. The authorities interrogated him harshly. At first he tried to deny everything, but under pressure, he admitted that he had had an intimate relationship with Catherine before she ascended the throne. The entire court shuddered, because if the queen had entered into marriage immorally, it was not only a moral crime, but also a political one. It was considered a direct threat to the throne, an insult to the king. When Catherine learned of Derham's arrest, she was overcome with fear. She tried to hide documents, destroy letters, and deny the relationship, but every lie only made the situation worse. Soon Thomas Kelleper was also arrested. Unlike Derham, who talked too much to save his life, Kelleper was cold and calculating, but in the end he also confessed. He had secret meetings with the Queen at night, alone, with the help of Lady Arford. And then there was no turning back. Henry, consumed by humiliation, locked himself in his chambers, unwilling to see anyone for several days. It was said that he screamed at night, that he raged in fury. The walls, which seemed alive, according to some servants, witnessed Henry crying like a child, while others claimed that he was no longer a man, but a beast, wounded and ready to destroy everything he loved. Finally, the king gave the order to arrest Catherine. The young woman was led out of her room, her face as white as wax. She trembled and asked again and again, "What have I done? What have I done?" But no one answered. She was sent to the Abbey of Sion, where she was placed under strict surveillance. She was no longer a queen, no longer a wife. She had become little more than a prisoner. It was there that her real torment began. She was completely isolated. The doors remained locked, the windows were boarded up, and her food was delivered in such a way that she could not see the faces of those who brought it. Catherine spent hours staring at the ceiling, reliving her mistakes, her decisions, her illusions. Sometimes she screamed, sometimes she cried until she fell asleep. But the worst thing was the silence, not knowing whether the king would forgive her or execute her. Meanwhile, Parliament quickly passed a new bill that declared it treason to conceal a woman's past sexual experience before marrying the king. It was a law written specifically for Catherine. As soon as it was approved, her fate was sealed. The interrogations of the conspirators became brutal. Lady Arford, who had helped arrange meetings between Catherine and Thomas Kelliper, was interrogated for hours until her mind broke. She suffered a mental breakdown, speaking nonsense, laughing and crying at the same time. She was declared insane, but even that did not save her. The king insisted that a special law be passed, according to which she was to be executed. Even insanity could not save her. Derham and Kelper were sentenced to death. The method of their execution differed, but was equally horrific. Kelper, due to his higher social status, was beheaded. His death was quick, though not without pain. Derham, on the other hand, suffered the most cruel execution. He was hanged, disemboweled, and torn to pieces in front of the public. His body was torn to pieces and displayed as a warning to those who dared to challenge the king. Caterina learned of the executions from her cell. She was told how they died, what they said, how they screamed. That night she did not speak, did not eat, did not cry, just sat staring at the wall, motionless, while the world around her fell apart like a nightmare. A few days later she received the news she had so feared. She was to be executed. At first she did not react. Then she screamed, grabbed the curtains, begging for mercy. But there was no mercy at the court of Henry VIII. There was no room for forgiveness. In the days that followed, Catherine was transferred to the Tower of London, the very place where her cousin, Anne Boleyn, had been executed 7 years earlier. Here, every stone whispered of death. Every corner smelled of fear. The young woman was placed in a cell overlooking the river, allowed to walk in the courtyard, pray with a priest, and write farewell letters. Caterina wrote, but no one knows for sure what was in that letter. Some believe that she asked for forgiveness. Others believe that she still insisted on her innocence. The document was lost in the archives of time. On the night before her execution, Caterina made an unusual request. She wanted to practice how to properly place her head on the block. The guards, horrified, agreed and brought an improvised log. Catherine knelt down, laid her neck on it, and repeated the gesture several times in silence, with tragic dignity. She knew that her last image would be one of calmness. She knew that history would condemn her, but at least she wanted to leave with elegance. At dawn, when the bells of the tower rang out with a hollow, mournful echo, the sky was gray, covered with thick fog. Catherine Howard was led to the scaffold in a dark dress, slowly rising with her head held high. Some witnesses claim that she whispered prayers, others that she uttered the name of Thomas Culper. She stepped onto the platform and looked at the executioner. She said only a few words that chilled the blood of all present. I die as the king's wife, but I would have liked to die as Thomas Culper's wife. The sword fell. But the story did not end there. Catherine Howard's body was buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave inside the Royal Chapel of St. Peter's in the Tower of London, next to the remains of her cousin, Anne Boleyn, who had been executed by the same king for treason. History seemed to repeat itself, like a curse, a chain that could not be broken for women who dared to touch the crown of Henry VIII. The people reacted with mixed feelings. Some despised her, others pitied her, but many began to perceive Henry not as a just monarch, but as an insatiable executioner. Catherine was his 5th wife. One had already died, another had been rejected, a third had been executed, and now this one had fallen victim to the sword. How many more would it take to appease the king's fury? Henry did not attend the execution. He remained in his palace, surrounded by silence and shadows. For weeks he avoided talking about it. People said he had suddenly aged, that he walked hunched over, that the ulcer on his leg was constantly festering. He was no longer the strong and fearsome man he had once been. Now he was a giant in his twilight years, consumed by his sins and passions. The days following the execution were overshadowed by silence in the royal court. Musicians stopped playing, Balls were cancelled, laughter disappeared. Henry ordered all portraits of Catherine to be destroyed and her letters burned. He wanted to erase her memory from the palace, but he could not erase her from his own memory. It is said that at night he cried out her name in his sleep, cursing everyone around him, his loneliness becoming unbearable. Henry sought solace in religion, but neither sermons nor prayers could ease his torment. The king, who had broken ties with the Pope to divorce his first wife, now felt like a cursed man, doomed to repeat his tragedy over and over again. The ghost of Catherine haunted him, as did the ghosts of Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour. No death brought him peace, no execution cleansed his sins. Contemporaries began to rewrite the story of Catherine Howard. Some portrayed her as an unfaithful libertine, a woman without morals who deserved her fate, while others, on the contrary, considered her a naive young woman, manipulated by her family and condemned by society. In a man's world, who was right? Was Catherine guilty of her actions, or was she a victim of the system that surrounded her? Did she ever have the opportunity to choose her own destiny? The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere between two extremes. Catherine was not a saint, but she was not a demon either. She was a young woman raised in an atmosphere of frivolity and idleness, who suddenly found herself at the center of power, with no preparation or protection. She was used by the Howards, desired by the king, watched by the court, and betrayed by those who promised to care for her. Ultimately, she became a victim of a system that did not forgive mistakes, especially when those mistakes came from a woman. However, there is something that keeps her story alive, something that remains even after her death, trial, and execution. Catherine Howard, unlike many other forgotten queens, left a deep mark because her end was not just an execution. It was a cry, a warning, a sign of the price that had to be paid for a place that was inaccessible to those who did not fit the mold of power. Her figure has been reproduced in literature, theater, and cinema, sometimes as a victim, sometimes as a villain, but always as a mirror of what ambition, desire, and fear can cause in a court rotten to the core. Her story is an echo of many women who, like her, tried to love in a world where love was a crime if it did not fit into the script predetermined by the throne. And as the centuries pass and graves are covered with oblivion, Catherine Howard remains alive in the memory of those who dare to look beyond the pages of history books. Her tragedy is not only a story of the past, but also an eternal warning. In the halls of power, no one is safe, not even the queen.